In the middle of the 14th century, a healthy person could go to sleep at night and wake up facing their own certain death. A sudden fever would strike without any warning, followed by dark, painful swellings that appeared under the arms and along the neck. Within a matter of days, or sometimes just a few hours, entire families were simply gone. The church bells rang so often for the dead that cities eventually stopped counting the bodies altogether. Graveyards overflowed, the streets fell into a terrifying silence, and a single question echoed through the ruins of Europe. Everyone wondered if they were witnessing the actual end of the world. What the people of that era did not realize was that they were living through the deadliest pandemic in recorded human history. This catastrophe would eventually kill up to half of the population of Europe and permanently reshape the foundations of civilization. This was the Black Death, a biological apocalypse where once it began, there was no escape. To understand the scale of this devastation, we must first look at the height from which humanity was about to fall. The early 14th century was actually an apex of stability and remarkable growth for the High Middle Ages. Thanks to a long period of warm climate, harvests had been bountiful for generations, and the population had nearly doubled. Great cities like Paris, Florence, and London were vibrant, densely packed hives of human activity. Gothic cathedrals were rising toward the sky, symbols of a society that felt technologically capable and closer to the divine than ever before. Most importantly, the medieval world was deeply interconnected through a vast global trade network. A merchant in Venice could buy silk that had traveled the entire length of Asia through networks secured by the Mongol Empire. This medieval worldwide web moved spices, gold, and new ideas across continents with unprecedented speed. It was a glorious and optimistic era, but this interconnectedness was a double-edged sword. The same infrastructure that brought immense wealth was about to deliver the greatest disaster in history. Society was perfectly laid out for a global catastrophe it could not see, understand, or fight. The origin of this apocalypse lay thousands of miles away from Europe, in the windswept and harsh steppes of Central Asia. In this landscape of extremes, an ancient biological agent called Yersinia pestis had existed for thousands of years. This bacterium is a weapon of ruthless efficiency, living naturally within rodent populations like marmots and ground squirrels. For centuries, it remained in a stable ecological balance, far from major human centers. However, in the 1330s, a period of severe ecological stress disrupted this delicate balance. Driven by hunger and climate change, infected rodents migrated closer to human settlements, bringing their deadly fleas with them. The jump from animal to human occurred at trading outposts along the Silk Road, and the first victims had no idea what was happening. They suffered from high fevers and the terrifying, oozing swellings known as buboes. News traveled slowly in the ancient world, but rumors of total disaster moved faster than the merchant caravans. By the early 1340s, reports reached the Mediterranean of entire civilizations in the east vanishing into thin air. The Europeans listened to these tales of rains of fire with a mix of horror and detached curiosity. They viewed these events as distant tragedies occurring in exotic lands, perhaps as divine retribution for foreign beliefs. Having no concept of germ theory, they didn't realize that the spices on their tables traveled the same road as their executioner. The geographical pivot point of this nightmare was the city of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula. Kaffa was a fortified and wealthy colony of the Republic of Genoa, serving as the crucial hinge between Asia and Europe. In 1346, Kaffa was under siege by the mighty army of the Golden Horde, led by Khan Jani Beg. The siege dragged on for months until a silent killer began to stalk the Mongol camps. The besieging army, living in cramped and unsanitary conditions, became the perfect breeding ground for the bacteria. Soldiers began dying by the thousands, their bodies turning dark with gangrene even before they took their last breath. Witnessing his army dissolve, Johnny Beg made a horrific decision that would change the course of human history. In a desperate act of biological warfare, he ordered the plague-ridden corpses of his soldiers to be loaded onto catapults. For several days, the sky over Kaffa rained dead bodies, smashing onto roofs and into public market squares. The psychological terror was immense, but the biological impact was immediate and total. The bacteria infiltrated the city through the fluids of the corpses and the fleas seeking new, warm hosts. The unbreakable fortress of Kaffa had been breached from the inside out. Panic gripped the city as wealthy Genoese merchants realized their home was doomed. They used their greatest asset, their ships, to flee the harbor with their cargo and unseen stowaways. 12 galleys slipped away, sailing past a dying Constantinople and into the open Mediterranean. This sea was the economic engine of Europe, and these fleeing ships became vectors of death. They docked at major hubs to resupply, unknowingly seeding the infection at every single stop along their route home. The first major European port to fall was Messina in Sicily in the year 1347. When the galleys arrived, the dock workers were greeted by a scene straight from hell. Most of the sailors were already dead, their bodies rotting on the decks in the sun. The few survivors were delirious and covered in black boils that dripped blood and pus. The port authorities realized the danger too late and ordered the ships to leave immediately. But the true agents of transmission, the black rats and their fleas, had already scurried onto the docks. Messina became the tragic test case for Europe, and it failed miserably as the social fabric disintegrated within weeks. People fled to the countryside in a panic, only to spread the contagion further across the island. As news of the great pestilence spread, other ports tried to close their harbors, but medieval quarantine was a leaky sieve. Greed often overcame caution, and ships laden with valuable spices often bribed their way into port. By early 1348, the great maritime republics of Genoa and Venice were crumbling. They eventually developed the concept of the lazaretto, where ships had to wait 40 days before entering the city. This gave us the word quarantine, derived from the Italian for 40 days. But for the first wave, it was far too late. The gondolas of Venice became funeral barges, piling bodies high as they navigated the silent and empty canals. From Italy, the disease moved west to France and crossed the Adriatic Sea. The coastal perimeter was breached, and the plague turned inland to face the dense heart of Europe. Cities like Paris and London were walled enclosures with narrow alleys and open sewers, making them hygienic tinderboxes. When the plague hit a major metropolis, it didn't just kill individuals, it killed the city as a functioning organism. The best medical minds of the century were completely baffled by the mounting death toll. Their framework was based on ancient theories of corrupted air and planetary alignments rather than bacteria. Doctors advised people not to bathe, believing it opened the pores to the deadly vapors. They burned aromatic woods to combat the smell of death and lanced the buboes, which only spread the infection faster. Every rational attempt to stop the disease seemed to only feed its hunger. This realization created a profound psychological crisis that shattered the bonds of society. Writers like Boccaccio recorded chilling accounts of fathers abandoning their own sons and wives leaving husbands to die alone. The sick were often walled up in their homes, and the intricate machinery of medieval life simply stopped. Bakeries stopped baking, courts closed their doors, and the laws were ignored because there was no one left to enforce them. The dead piled up faster than they could be buried in consecrated ground, leading to the creation of massive plague pits. In these trenches, bodies were stacked like cordwood in layers, covered only by a thin dusting of soil. In the 14th century, an event of this magnitude could only be interpreted as direct punishment from God. People flocked to cathedrals to pray, which only served to spread the respiratory form of the plague even faster. When prayers failed and priests died as quickly as sinners, a radical and desperate form of piety emerged. The Flagellant movement swept across Europe, featuring bands of men who marched from town to town. They would strip to the waist and whip themselves with iron-tipped scourges in public displays of penance. They hoped to take the sins of the world onto their own flesh to appease the divine wrath. However, as the death toll continued to mount, the public began to look for a tangible scapegoat for their misery. A horrific conspiracy theory took root, claiming that Jewish communities were poisoning the wells of Christendom. Despite official condemnations by the Pope, who pointed out that everyone was dying regardless of faith, mob mentality took over. Horrific pogroms erupted across the Holy Roman Empire, and entire communities were rounded up and burned alive. The Black Death unleashed not just biological horror, but the darkest and most violent aspects of human nature. It was a mistake to think the plague was only an urban phenomenon. While cities were the epicenters, the plague traveled to the countryside, where 90% of the population lived. Thousands of small villages were completely wiped out, and the manorial system of labor ground to a halt. Harvests rotted in the fields with no one to bring them in, and herds of animals wandered aimlessly until they turned feral. The carefully managed medieval landscape was slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. By 1350, the plague reached the northern limits of Scotland, Scandinavia, and even Greenland. By 1351, the initial catastrophic wave finally began to burn itself out as it ran out of victims. The fog began to lift, revealing a continent that had been fundamentally and permanently transformed. Modern historians estimate that between 75 and 200 million people died across Eurasia. In Europe alone, half of the population perished in less than 5 years of total terror. The survivors emerged into a world that looked the same, but functioned on entirely different rules. The massive depopulation created a severe labor shortage, which ironically gave the surviving peasants more power. Lords were forced to offer higher wages and better conditions to get their land worked. This cracked the rigid structures of serfdom and began the slow emergence of the modern economic world. However, the psychological scars remained in the art of the period, which became obsessed with death. The dance of death became a popular motif, showing that the grave was the ultimate equalizer for both kings and peasants. The Black Death was the greatest trauma Western civilization ever endured, proving the fragility of human systems against nature. The society that rebuilt itself was more cynical and forced to adapt to a new reality. In the end, the path of death cleared the ground for a new era of human history to begin. For centuries, this was treated as a distant medieval nightmare, but empty streets and fear of the air feel uncomfortably familiar today. The plague was an ultimate test of civilization, and history shows that such tests have a way of repeating.